Welcome to Blind Spots. I'm Steve Reardon. It's my pleasure to have Kori Shake back with me on the podcast today. She's a returning guest, one of very few. Kori is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution.
Slow learner.
Slow learner indeed. She is the editor with Jim Mattis of the book Warriors and Citizens, American Views of Our Military. She teaches thinking about war at Stanford, is a columnist for Foreign Policy magazine, and a contributor to War on the Rocks. She's also a regular contributor on the David Rothkopf Foreign Policy Editors Roundtable podcast, which I think has become very, very popular. Kori, welcome to the podcast.
It is such a pleasure to be with you, Steve.
I'm still waiting for my mug from the Editors Roundtable, but I understand that those things get lost in the post.
You have to make a public plea on Twitter and tell us what you wish we were talking about that we weren't.
Well, we're going to get an opportunity today because I want to go back over, and I know we were kind of short on time, but we've had a bunch of foreign policy events. The Tomahawk missile strikes in Syria, the Moab dropped in Afghanistan, tensions increasing in North Korea. So very quickly, looking back on the first 100 days of the Trump presidency, what do you see from a foreign policy point of view? Where are we?
I think they have done a couple of things well, but in general have been much too opaque about what they're doing. And, of course, the main problem with national security policy in the Trump administration is the president.
Right.
So what they've done well, I do think it makes a lot of sense to return authorities that had been very carefully managed at high political levels in the Obama White House, to return those authorities back to DOD for sizing the force, for announcements about the flow of troops, for rules of engagement, for
there was even a discussion about this massive ordnance bomb, that this was called essentially by General Nicholson in Afghanistan. And there was some criticism about that, but I think you're generally in favor of that.
Yeah, I think actually allowing the warfighting commanders to fight the war is a good choice. Where I would fault the Trump administration is what they haven't done, at least they have not admitted to doing publicly, and I and a bunch of other people watching pretty carefully can't tell what their strategy is if they have a strategy. It makes a lot of sense to devolve authorities back into the military chain of command for the operational and tactical level decisions about the conduct of the wars. What would not make sense is allowing the Pentagon or any other agency to establish the strategy itself or to operate independently of having a strategy. And I do think I at least can't tell what their strategy is in many instances. I think I have discerned it in Syria, but I don't know what it is in Afghanistan. I don't know what it is for the Middle East writ large. I don't know how serious they are about boxing the Iranians back in conventionally. I have no idea what they think they're doing on North Korea or on managing China or Russia.
Right. So let's start with the first of those. I think it's top of mind, but let's talk about the Syria engagement. So the first thing is he did enforce some repercussions to the use of chemical weapons.
Which is so long overdue and so good, not just for the long-suffering people of Syria, although I wish we cared about dying Syrians, not merely the means by which they are being killed.
Right.
But establishing boundaries, even in warfare, matters morally. It matters for who we are as a society, for not becoming what we're fighting against. It matters for our ability to incorporate veterans back into our civil society after the war. It matters actually as a hard power fact that if WMD are excluded from warfare, the United States is much more likely to win because of the strength of our conventional forces. So there are good strategic, moral, and civic reasons for setting boundaries in war, and I think it was disgraceful President Obama didn't do it, and it's terrific President Trump did. I only wish the Trump administration had been clearer about how the WMD retaliation fit into their broader Syria strategy. I think I see what their Syria strategy is, which is dramatically pick up the pace of defeating ISIS. The Obama administration had underestimated how virulent the effects of a slow-rolling strategy would be. And then once those effects were obvious, they still didn't correct course. I think the Trump administration is dramatically picking up the pace of operations.
And where are you seeing evidence of this?
I'm seeing evidence of it in the number of drone strikes and the number of troops that are being sent to Iraq and Syria, in the way that American forces are being allowed to be in the combat zone, advising and assisting Iraqi and other forces that are directly engaged in the fight, the weapons and intelligence they are supplying. I believe I also see it in the way the administration is averting its eyes from the domestic governance concerns that previous American administrations and many human rights organizations have with many of the countries in the Middle East who are aligned alongside us in fighting ISIS. I also think I see it in their willingness to leave Bashar al-Assad in power, which is an enormous compromise.
And do you think that holds even hypothetically beyond a ISIS defeat? I mean, is the U.S. ever invested in regime change?
I don't believe the Trump administration is interested in regime change. Okay. My read of the senior people in the administration is that the long shadow of the Iraq War is perhaps affecting their judgment in believing that regime change equals chaos, when of course there are good, solid examples from the Balkans, from northern Iraq after the 1991 war, of effective regime change, because you grow a leadership, an indigenous leadership, and you remain there to provide security and work in close cooperation until they are able to govern themselves in a way that we would support them governing.
Is this linked to America's, or at least the administration's, appetite for staying post the conflict? So I guess the Powell Doctrine more broadly, but this idea that do we have the sticking power to stay and get the job done, as, you know, some of these other places you mentioned? Yeah,
so my read of the Powell Doctrine is that it's a gut check for the civilian leadership about whether they're really willing to commit to outcomes rather than use military force symbolically or in often ineffectual, limited engagements. I don't think the Powell Doctrine opposes long-term stabilization operations at the far end of it. I think it's part of committing to the objectives you want to achieve. I do think the Secretary of Defense has already testified to Congress that he supports leaving American troops in Iraq decades after ISIS is defeated. I actually think one of the achievements the Trump administration is committed to, and it's very much to their credit, is actually winning the Iraq War, which was nearly won in 2010 when the Obama administration wrote it off. And I think one of the reflexes you see from Mattis and McMaster and others in the administration is a belief that victory had been squandered by political hesitance, and they would like to see that table reset.
Okay, so you think you have a handle on the Trump administration strategy in Syria. What would your strategy in Syria be?
Yeah. I favor the ramping up of operations against ISIS. I would almost everything else I would do differently. Well, I'm sorry. There's one other thing I favor. I favor the very close coordination with regional allies to thrash out common war aims. One of the things the Obama administration wasn't willing to do was make compromises that would bring regional countries on board. And good regime change strategies require buy-in and cooperative work by the countries in the region. So I think those two things they're getting right. I believe they are profoundly mistaken in committing to Bashar al-Assad remaining in power. I think a much smarter strategy would be to get a whole bunch of diplomats in the region, including American diplomats, to roll their sleeves up and find Syrians who are committed to the kind of future Syria that we would like to see and that we believe will bring peace and stability in the region, commit to helping them, not just until ISIS is defeated, but for as long as it takes for them to build a stable and decent Syria whose people don't have to flee by the million and fear their own government. That's one big thing.
It's very hard to have a diplomatic surge, if you like, when you're slashing the State Department by something like 30%, though, right?
Hard, but not impossible.
Okay.
Right? Remember that, so I don't favor the cuts to the State Department, but the size of the Foreign Service has doubled since 2001.
Okay.
And I'm not sure our return on investment has doubled since 2001. Just to use one example, Secretary Powell, Secretary Rice, and Secretary Clinton all each gave an additional at least 1,000 additional Foreign Service officers in the effort to create what's called a training float, to create opportunities for professional education and mid-career training for our diplomats. And the State Department used all of them to staff agency slots rather than create the kind of training that everyone agrees is necessary. So the State Department has problems of institutional culture to be overcome, but that doesn't excuse a 30% cut across the space of a year to America's diplomatic investment. If for no other reason, then everybody's going to have to be explaining what the hell the president means in his epigrammatic tweets that seem to be contrasting with the policies his own administration is announcing.
So I interrupted you, sorry. So you were saying you wanted this diplomatic surge as your first piece?
Yeah, so figure out who are the Syrians who are going to create a Syria that's not going to be a threat to its neighbors and not going to be a threat to its own people. Work with those people diplomatically, work with humanitarian aid organizations to facilitate. I think the leading edge should be humanitarian. So if you think about the example of northern Iraq after the 1991 war, right? The Kurds are now the great sectarian success story of Iraq. There was no reason to believe that would be true in 1991. But by providing security, by leading with a humanitarian mission, that helped the people of the region to see us as partners, not as an imposition on them, providing security over the long term, identifying leaders who could grow into the kind of government that you wanted to see because they ran school boards, they were mayors, they perked up through the system in positive ways. We know how to do this. We're just not doing this. The third thing is we got to find some way of squaring the circle with Turkey. I don't see how you can intervene in Syria sustainably and remain at cross purposes with the government of Turkey. And that's going to be awful because we don't want the same things they want. But we either have to find a way to seal the border between Turkey and Syria, or we need to make common cause at some level with the Turks.
So one of the things that always comes up, and I think that's super interesting, one of the things that always comes up is this increase of drone strikes, support for local allies, military intervention generally in Syria, ultimately pushes up the potential for a conflict and essentially killing Russians, right? Killing Russian advisors, killing Russians that are on the ground, killing Russian allies, and the idea that this escalates our relationship with Russia. Is that a legitimate risk?
Yeah, it absolutely is a legitimate risk. And you can attenuate it in some ways by, as I believe we did on the strike in Syria, announcing to the Russians what you're going to do so that they can remove their forces if they choose to. I think before the strike on Syria, during the Obama administration, we were in the position of being the only people who were deterred by the risk of escalation.
Yeah.
And I think the Trump administration has, in a way that's slightly unnerving but also important, reasserted that we too are willing to run risks to achieve our objectives in Syria, and the Russians need to be worried about escalation as much as we need to be worried about escalation.
Right. So what do you think escalation looks like? So what happens when you kill 10 Russian advisors in an airstrike?
Yeah. Highly contingent on the circumstances, right? So first of all, whether you're targeting them on purpose or whether you hit them mistakenly. There are some things the Russians are doing that I think validate targeting them.
Okay.
When Russian aircraft circled back after the chemical weapons strike by the Syrian government, when the Russians circled back to bomb the hospitals that were treating the patients, evidently in an effort to camouflage the chemical weapons use, I think that's a war crime, and that makes them legitimate targets of American military operations in Syria. And part of the dynamic of escalation depends on whether you have clearly communicated what you're going to do in the circumstances coming. So, I think if in that instance we had shot down those Russian airplanes, that would have been an incendiary potential escalation.
Yeah.
If we announce any aircraft of any country that are bombing hospitals, we are going to target and shoot down. That then puts the onus of escalation on the Russians. So a lot of managing the risks in those kinds of circumstances is being clear and consistent about what the rules of operation are, both with the Russians and publicly.
I think a lot of the discussion that you had last year, especially in foreign policy, was this idea that Putin had played a very weak hand really, really well. Do you still feel like he's playing that hand well? And is there a way, are these potentially the tactics you should be employing to, play our hand better?
That's a great question, Steve. Yes, I do think he's still playing a weak hand well. President Trump evidently agreed in their most recent phone call that the U.S. was going to participate in the Russian-sponsored peace talks for Syria. So it seems to me that the President of the United States is actually a pretty easy mark for our adversaries in negotiations. What's that great line from Jane Austen's novel Persuasion? When Captain Wentworth's sister is describing that she believes her brother's about to make a very foolish choice of marriage, a few compliments of the Navy, and he's a woman's for the asking. I feel like that's a pretty good description of the president.
Right. Well, that's fantastic. So I guess we got to move tack. I could talk about Syria for hours, but let's talk about another weak hand being played in some fashion. And I want to just talk about North Korea quickly. So as you say, you're not sure about the current policy in North Korea. There was some discussion around the failure of their current missiles being a cyber offensive that the U.S. had launched. I don't know if you buy into any of that.
God, I hope that's true. I hope we're that good.
I know, right?
I'm teensy bit skeptical.
Yes.
Even though the North Koreans have to import most of their components, and that leaves wide opportunities, most of their imports are actually from China. And so either we would have to be smart enough that the Chinese couldn't track our mischief, or they would have to be complicit in it. That would be magnificent if they were complicit in it, but I see very little in their public behavior that suggests that they actually are helping us do that. So I fear this may be a little bit like Latin American concerns in the 1970s that the CIA was behind everything that happened in their countries. And I just wish we were that good, but I'm skeptical that we are.
Yeah. Okay, so we sent a carrier group there or not there to Australia and then maybe there. What is going on? What do you think the current policy is, and what do you think the policy should be?
The current policy, as I understand it, is that the last 20 years, of American administrations stalling for time, hoping that the North Korean government would fall, or that they would become so desperate to be a normal country with, economic growth and stuff like that, that they would ramp back their nuclear and ballistic missile ambitions.
It's not a crazy idea. I mean, we saw it firsthand in South Africa. Essentially, the international community applied so much pressure that the desire to be a normal country took over.
Absolutely. South Africa is the great success story of international sanctions.
We're trying really hard to reverse that success, but certainly in the mid-90s we were.
Sadly, I agree with you.
Yeah.
But the North Korean government appears to have ruthlessly full control over the society. And the suffering of North Koreans at some point doesn't appear to be extending to the leadership class. And if we could find ways, closing down on bank accounts of wealthy and influential North Koreans, that kind of stuff, maybe that would ramp up the pressure. So I don't understand what the administration's doing, though, because while they are suggesting that the time of strategic patience is over, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and the Director of National Intelligence issued a joint statement last week trying to calm the roiling waters that the administration's own statements and military actions had created. So I think, the president seems to like creating a whole bunch of chaos because he feels like that expands his negotiating room. And that may well be true, but there are two really big downsides with that. One is that the United States, as the enforcer of international order, it's much costlier to do and more dangerous to do if people don't know what you're trying to do.
Right.
And alarming horses in the streets is not good policing as a general rule. The second thing is the North Korea problem has a very small margin of error, right? I don't know what the North Korean government thinks it's doing, and I don't know a lot of other people who have confidence they know what it's doing either. And estimates of the number of South Korean casualties that could occur within just 3 hours of the start of a conflict are in the hundreds of thousands. So even if we could succeed in an elegant preemptive strike that knocks out the North Korean nuclear program, its ballistic missiles, and its leadership, Seoul, South Korea would still be at enormous risk in the first 2 hours before the military laid down their arms, the North Korean military, and started streaming across the South Korean border for food.
Yeah.
So the administration's making all the boats rock in a way that I think they hope will increase pressure on the Chinese to solve this problem for us. And it would be great if it works, but I'm skeptical that it will work. I think the odds are as likely that it will provoke a war on the Korean Peninsula as the odds are likely that it will solve this problem. And given the number of South Koreans at risk in this, a couple of other worrisome things that I think kind of give this sense of scattershot action by the administration. H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor, was asked on Meet the Press whether the United States would actually risk an attack on South Korea. His answer was a Delphic, it's the job of the President of the United States to protect the people of the United States. What that suggests to me is he is willing to risk South Korea. And that's no way to run an alliance. That's no way to be able to fight your wars as away games with allies and their territory at risk rather than having to fight home games on American soil.
Yeah.
The other thing is that after the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and Director of National Intelligence issued this very sensible, calming statement, within 24 hours, President Trump gave an interview suggesting we might have a big, big war in North Korea. And so and then said the South Koreans should pay for the missile defenses that we have already worked out a treaty agreement on, and also said that we should abrogate the South Korean trade treaty. The South Koreans are in the middle of a presidential election that resulted after the impeachment of their previous president. This is a delicate time to be roiling the domestic politics of a close and treasured ally of our country.
So is there anything to be done? I mean, is there any way forward from this rock and a hard place that you've portrayed in North Korea?
There are lots of ways forward, many of them bad, some of them good, which would, the first thing to do would be the thing that I think the Secretaries of State, Defense, and the DNI were trying to do, which is make clear that our policy is one of economic sanctions and diplomatic pressure.
Right.
Because I don't see military options that adequately protect our allies in South Korea to be as recklessly talking about military strikes as the president is suggesting. So I would walk that back.
Kori, as always, so much more to talk about. Thank you so much for coming on Blind Spot.
It was a great pleasure, my friend.